Hi everyone! Welcome to our first program, I believe, in our literature club. We're going to be looking at traveling around Europe. So what this program basically is it's going to be a kind of a journey across countries in Europe. Some countries, not all, we can't cover all 50, but we're going to be covering almost 9 to 10, right? We're going to be looking at kind of the intersection of literature and culture. And we're going to be looking at the most famous authors and writers and some quotes from their text just to see, oh, well, yeah, this country has this kind of authors, they kind of wrote under this kind of circumstances, and that's what causes differences between each and every country, what causes the kind of spark, the cultural identity in each country. So our first country is going to be Ireland. Let's begin. Ireland may be known to you as leprechauns and St. Patrick's Day celebrations, but it has so much cultural and historical context behind its literature. Ireland has a profound literary history that started from oral traditions way back before, I believe, before the Middle Ages even, and by the end, we have so much renowned Irish authors currently that has won Nobel Prizes and is recognized all across the world for their brilliant writing. And yeah, we're going to be looking into some depths into Ireland. Our focus is primarily going to be in the 1500s to the 1900s. That is the most classical kind of era that we're thinking about. We're not going to be able to look at modern writers currently, but I believe that there is a program that is soon to come that will cover more modern writers. So yeah, let's begin our journey, guys. Our destination's first one is Ireland. It is almost at the farthest western corner of the entire Europe. Okay, so Ireland, right? We know it for its lush landscapes and vibrant cultures, but it really has a rich literary history and heritage, right? And they have most writers, they write about themes of identity, independence, nature, resilience, and these kind of works are profoundly shaping famous works like James Joyce, W.B. Yeats, and Seamus Heaney. I'm sorry if I pronounced that very wrong. And these authors really bring poetic innovation to the world. So we're going to be looking at their kind of modern techniques, their enduring creativity on the global stage that has allowed them their literary geniuses and recognition all across the world. Okay, the four books or the four works we're going to be looking at is A Modest Proposal, The Importance of Being Earnest, Dracula, and Ulysses. And I believe that even if you're not familiar with most literary works, you're going to be familiar with Dracula because it's a character, it has become modernized in so many movies. I think a lot of books do use Dracula as the kind of model for like a gothic monster. We can talk about this more when we get to there, but it's really interesting to look at how works back in the 1800s, 1897, can impact modern writers writing in the 21st century. Okay, so the authors, we're going to be looking more at these authors individually. Jonathan Swift, first of all, he was a satirist and a clergyman. He lived way back in the 1700s in Ireland, and his works, especially his satire work, has become kind of the modern model for all literary work. So his most famous work is really A Modest Proposal here, and it has become renowned to the degree that once you start like going into writing satire, what people would say is, oh, go read A Modest Proposal, because that's kind of where satire started in the first place for modern literature. Okay, the second one is Oscar Wilde. He was a playwright and a poet, and I think Oscar Wilde is pretty famous. I've heard that there is a current kind of trend that kind of revisits Oscar Wilde on TikTok, but you may not know him. He was a very, very famous playwright. He was a very, very famous author and a poet, and he wrote a lot of philosophical kind of reflection pieces. One of his most famous pieces is A Historical Criticism, and I have not had a chance to read that yet, but it sounds very, very interesting. And if you're kind of interested in a very unique perspective that Oscar Wilde can present, philosophically, I would definitely recommend going into some of his works and looking at it. The third person is Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker is the very person who wrote the Dracula. He made the characters, he kind of came up with the kind of gothic background, and so you can kind of recognize him as being the first person to start this kind of literary tradition of Dracula and blood sucking vampires, right? What's really interesting about his work is that the Dracula here that we see in his work is kind of different from the Dracula that we see in literary traditions, right? We see Dracula these days in, I believe, a lot of romance novels because they're kind of presented as a very alluring but mysterious figure. But the Dracula here is very much horrible, and it is a very terrifying gothic novel that I would definitely recommend you read. Even if you're not familiar with most classical literature, Dracula is something that I believe most students would definitely be willing to read. Okay, final person, James Joyce. He was a novelist and he was also kind of like Oscar Wilde. He was a philosophical kind of writer. He really tried to use a lot of Irish background in his writing, and he also wrote books like, I believe, A Young Artist's. I'm sorry, I do not remember his work quite well, but he has a lot of famous philosophical work as well. And I think his most famous work is indeed Ulysses. It might be Dubliners, but I'm not sure about that. But Ulysses is definitely his well-renowned well acknowledged work that we're going to be looking at today. Yeah, so we're going to be looking at this. What you can kind of see too is this is 1729, 1895, 1897, and 1922, and kind of look at how literary like style and technique also progressed, right? Okay, let's move on. Let's first look at A Modest Proposal. So, A Modest Proposal, the full title is A Modest Proposal for Preserving the Children of Poor People from Being a Burden to their Parents or Country, and for making them beneficial to the public, right? What you can immediately notice here is public, the spelling, there is a K. This is because old kind of English, if you read Shakespeare, most of his original spelling is going to be a lot different from the way we spell things. And even in the 1700s, he wrote this in 1729, even then some spellings were different and some words were just used differently. And I think that's really interesting, just seeing how words have kind of how words have changed, right? Okay, so let's look more into A Modest Proposal. What's interesting is it's for preserving children of poor people from being a burden to their parents or country, right? So, um, it's really interesting, right? He's kind of presenting having children as a burden and making them beneficial to the public as if they need to be beneficial. What kind of writing is this? Well, A Modest Proposal is a satirical essay, so it is a satire. It is not really about preserving children and making them be of service to the public. That is not its primary purpose. It is to kind of make a satire out of a current problem, to make it kind of funny, and also make it reflect the kind of changes that are required in the world. And what it focuses on is Ireland's problem of poverty and overpopulation. And he also points out throughout that it is because of British exploitation of Ireland at the time that causes this kind of problem of poverty and overpopulation in Ireland. And he uses kind of irony to criticize this and makes fun of the cold, calculated ways in which the British Empire is kind of imposing upon them. So it's kind of as if he's saying, oh, well, the British is dehumanizing us to such a degree that, it wouldn't be much of a difference if we started using our babies and selling them as food for the wealthy. And this is just a crazy thing, right? Um, having your kids being sold as food for the wealthy, and this is obviously absurd. He does not mean this in reality, but it's a way to urge genuine reforms and compassion for the Irish population suffering under British exploitation. And an excerpt from this is, I do therefore humbly offer it to the public consideration that as these children are, by the law of nature, born for the support of their parents, if no other method can be thought on, may there not be very properly sold to the rich and genteel as food for their tables. And if you read through this, he keeps saying, oh, these children, they're not doing anything, they're such a burden, they're useless. Like when they're born, they rely on their parents for all their support, which is kind of like, which is a very obvious and also a fundamentally necessary thing. He's like, oh, well, they're kind of useless until they're like like 4 or 5, but then the money you take to grow them until 4 or 5 just is way larger than whatever they can make. So when they're really tiny children, before you need to use any money to care for them, we can kind of sell them as food. And right, and it's very very grotesque, a very very horrid solution if you think about it, but it's a critique of the inhuman policies and just the injustice that Irish people have been enduring. And it is a beautiful, beautifully written work. And although these kind of writings are different, I believe that he did translate this work. So possibly not, but he probably did. And in that case, more modern translations is probably available. So I think you should definitely go read into it. It's very, very, it's very very grotesque, very kind of scary almost, but also very interesting at the same time. I would definitely recommend, unless you're a very, very young student, you probably shouldn't read it then. Okay, let's move on to our second book, The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. And the full title is The Importance of Being Earnest, a trivial comedy for serious people by the author of Lady Windermere's Fan. Yeah, so Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest is a comedy that kind of critiques Victorian society. And what you immediately think of when you think of Victorian society may be different from what I think of, but I usually think of like very pompous dresses and very fancy balls and people wearing tuxedos like these and having really fancy kind of furniture all around their house. And I think that was kind of a lot of the conception that existed during Wilde's time. So it was very pompous, kind of very very posh, and people were like, "Oh ho ho, don't do that." Like they were focused on kind of the societal obligations that were within Victorian society. And Wilde, the kind of very I think I think a lot of people would say he's an emo in our current term, which is not a very accurate term because he was a brilliant, brilliant philosopher. But uh, it's a philosopher, but he was a very brilliant writer. So that's not necessarily true, but he was kind of against society in a lot of ways, and he would like to be alone. And in a lot of his writings, he kind of presents a very dark understanding of the world. That's like, oh, he was a very like very antagonistic person in general. Yeah, but this book focuses on two characters, Jack and Algernon, who creates kind of false identities to escape societal obligations, and he uses a lot of humor in his writing to expose the triviality and the kind of hypocrisy that exists in the upper class during the Victorian era. So, yeah, The Importance of Being Earnest is a very comedic play. This is also a satire, and you can kind of like assume that he was to a certain degree influenced by A Modest Proposal, because it is really the first satire I believe that exists for after the Middle Ages, and it's also in the same country with him. So Victorian, yeah, he focuses on a different topic. It's Victorian society, and it's focused on appearances, social status, marriage. If you read some Victorian novels like Jane Austen or someone like Charlotte Bronte, you kind of realize, oh, these people were really focused on who you get married with, right? The first sentence in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is about what men who has a substantial fortune wanting to get married. So this kind of societal appearances and societal obligations were kind of problematic to Wilde, and he uses kind of witty, very humorous dialogue and absurd situations to reveal the problems that exist in the upper class. A quote that is very famous is, "I can resist everything except temptation. In matters of grave importance, style, not sincerity, is the vital thing. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. To be natural is such a difficult pose to keep up." And this is kind of the essence of what he's trying to say. Nobody's sincere. Nobody's actually giving their genuine passion. Nobody's natural. They're always focusing on style and the appearance of things and not actually in the heart of things. Okay, next is Dracula. We're going to be looking at Gothic horror now. Dracula is a novel that combines kind of ancient folklore with modern fears. It talks about Count Dracula and his attempts to spread his curse in England, and he kind of preys upon female characters like Mina, and just he has a kind of eerie charisma and haunting atmosphere that really that kind of mixes fear and desire and clashes like ancient evil. This is kind of a hellish figure if you think of like Judeo-Christian influences, but also kind of a modern figure thinking about the kind of appearance and the personality he presents. So yeah, Dracula is just a lovely, compelling exploration of good versus evil that captivates the reader. So yeah, I just said most of that, but it's told through the diaries and letters of Jonathan Harker, and it's just very scary because you don't get to see Dracula's perspective. It's always in the victim's perspective. So they're like, oh, so I went to the house today and I'm kind of confused. I don't know why I'm here and they won't let me out, and I've tried to find a way to go down and I'm trying to figure things out, but it's very, very well written, and there is a reason why this book is so loved even after 200 years. A famous novel is Listen to them, the children of the night, what music they make. I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in, the castle is a veritable prison, and I am the warden. I am anxiously expecting you. The Count will be here directly. I know he is nervous to meet you, and he is so interested in your affairs that I can see that he is impatient for your arrival. He is most curious to meet you, as you will be most curious to meet him. This kind of shows the character and personality Dracula presents, and yeah, it's a really beautiful piece of writing that I think everyone should definitely try. Let's move on to our next novel, Ulysses. It is a groundbreaking, a modern novel that kind of that was inspired by the famous Odysseys by Homer. And I don't know if you've heard of Homer, but he was a very famous Greek writer. And just a little spoiler, we're going to be actually visiting Greece in our journey in this program, and we're going to be looking at Homer as well. But just as a heads up for understanding Ulysses, Odyssey, it's a novel that it's an epic poem, meaning it's a very long poem that uses kind of Greek folklore and Greek like the um, Greek gods to make a very compelling heroic novel, and the same thing is kind of here, right? In Homer's writing, Odyssey is the hero. That is, he's the protagonist. He kind of goes around, does all these brave things, and this is kind of parallelized in a way into a single day in the life of Leopold Bloom in Dublin. And that's what Ulysses is about, and it is a very beautiful piece of work that captures Joyce's ability to transform something mundane and monotonous into something vivid and true and absolutely inspiring. Yeah, so it's a parallel to Odysseys, and it's known for its stream of consciousness style. It kind of goes like according to someone's thought, kind of like capturing the complexity of human thought and experience, but it also makes the book kind of difficult to read. I think that's the case with a lot of James Joyce's novel. It is just very difficult to understand what he's getting at and what he wants to say at a given point. But yeah, I have not had a chance to read this. I've read some other works of James Joyce, but Ulysses I have not tried yet. But yeah, I've heard that it explores themes of life, love, identity, and kind of the ordinariness of life, and it's very beautiful. And a quote I found was, "The heaven tree of stars hung with humid night blue fruits. I threw the towel over my shoulder and went on. I saw the moon looking at me, and I looked at the moon. The stars are shining over the sea. I went to the window and saw the moon." This kind of, it's not like how a lot of writers would write. You know, a lot of writers would write, oh yeah, the heaven tree of stars, they were hanging with humid night blue fruits, and I threw the towel over my shoulder, and I walked on, and I looked at the moon. that's kind of how they would write it, but he's like, I threw the towel, and I saw the moon, and I looked at the moon, and the stars were shining again, the stars are repeated, the moon is repeated, and the moon is again repeated at the last line. This kind of writing is so very beautiful and vivid, and this is why I want to, this is why I wanted to share it with you guys. So, yeah, in conclusion, that's a very formal ending, but Ireland's literary tradition is a reflection of its history, its culture, and resilience. You saw how the same satire of Wilde and Swift can be on such different topics. Swift was about the Irish population's kind of oppression by the British exploitation, while Wilde's was about Victorian kind of pompousness and very, very kind of superficial traditions, and that kind of really reflects, oh, these writers were influenced not only by the country they are in, but by the era, by their society, but by the current problems they were facing. And that's very beautiful. And with James Joyce's work, I think you really see a lot of like the modern kind of city life as a Dubliner, and that's really dramatically different from something like what Stoker wrote about a Gothic mansion in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, I hope this presentation has really inspired you to explore these works and kind of further appreciate the enduring impact that literature can have, especially literature from like all the way across Ireland. And if you are an Irish person, I hope that you found something new here that you previously did not. If you guys have any comments, any questions, please leave them down in the comment section. And thank you so much. That is it for today. Bye-bye.